Thank you. All right, thank you. Feel a little bit worried. It's Friday afternoon and you've spent the morning talking about the importance of sleep. So we'll see how this goes. I'm pretty sure this is the most panoramic room I've ever spoken to, which might have two consequences. I'm not entirely sure how visible my slides will be when they come up. So shout if anything isn't clear to you. I shall try to avoid any kind of plane crash or car crash as we go. The thing I want to do really today is claim a permission to be a little bit reflective. I don't really want to come and just present to you for this hour. Ground myself in individual leadership, I guess. Maintaining a permission to be wrong, I'm usually fairly clear that I'm quite sure much of my work is wrong. And when I work out which bits, I'll be sure to let you know. But the point is, I'm almost equally sure that much of what we've seen before is also wrong. So I guess this is a time not to settle on new answers, but to be curious and to claim a space to explore. I adhere to a methodology across all my work of working out loud, of sharing both the perfect and the imperfect aspects of work. I'm an evidence-based practitioner, which I thought aligned very well with medical practice until I saw the NLP poster downstairs. Started making me nervous. I'm just working out if anybody's going to throw anything at me at that point. In terms of my work, it crosses between different sectors. I work quite widely in healthcare, both NHS in the UK, but also in the American systems, across manufacturing, pharmaceutical, but also in government and quite extensively in the military, looking again at these evolutions of different structures. So I'll try to bring in examples from across that. I pretty actively welcome heckling, so you are welcome to you'll have to wave quite boldly or just shout out if you want me to stop or dive into anything in more detail, but I'll also try to make sure we have time at the end for questions. So the context of my work is the social age, and I quite deliberately position this as kind of beyond the digital age, because clearly technology is having a radical impact on society. And I don't just mean in a rather naive first interpretation about looking at WhatsApp or looking at Facebook, and some of the political narratives we're seeing are frankly extremely naive as to the impact of these technologies. The real impacts are actually around our underlying sociology. They're around aspects of identity. They're around the nature of knowledge itself and access to knowledge. They're about evolutions in structures of power. Much of my work comes back to the notion of power, because really social systems are governed by power. So as technology evolves social systems, it fragments and disrupts established modes of power. And many of the structures of society, be they government or healthcare or military, are manifestations of structures of power. So there's a sort of reasonable argument that what's going to change isn't just the next iPhone that you have. It's actually going to be the society in which we live, and hence the skills and capability we need to thrive in this society. I guess, some aspects of the social age are reasonably clear to us. So, one aspect is connectivity. We are now connected in many different ways, almost all of which are outside the oversight or control of any organization, any government, any law enforcement agency, any educational institution. In our own research in the NHS earlier this year, we asked people about their learning communities, where they go in order to be effective. And they identified 17 different technologies that they use in order to be effective in their everyday work, 16 of which are not owned by the NHS. In fact, in many cases, 16 of which people are explicitly forbidden from using to share patient data. But it's unsurprising. People go to these spaces not because they're bad people trying to do bad things. They go to these spaces because they help them to be effective and to perform even better. When I surveyed groups of military aviation technicians in special forces groups in the US about where they go to solve their intractable engineering problems, the number one place they go, and the US military special forces spent $26 million last year specifically on secure social collaborative technology. And the number one place they go is WhatsApp. And they do that for quite interesting reasons. They describe it, clearly and articulately. Firstly, they can curate they can curate their problem, take photos, describe it, share videos, and then they assemble a sub-community, people who they trust. That word trust comes up a lot. So, the people on this table I trust, so they are in my WhatsApp group for this problem solving. I share my problem there. But there's an interesting secondary effect. They will be prepared to take people at a second degree of trust. So somebody on this table says, well, I trust these people. You should bring them in. I'm willing to do that. So trust seems to carry some way through social networks, unless somebody here betrays that trust, in which case I cease to trust them, but also, of course, it carries back here. I now execute somebody in this group who has betrayed my trust. In fact, most of the language people use about trust within this technologically connected world is emotive, emotional language around how these systems operate. Social systems are not just sort of complex, they're radically complicated. They're almost unknowably complicated. But it does bring to the fore the context of leadership today. Part of our power exists within a formal system, but much of our power exists within a social system. And here's the funny thing with those military aviation technicians, they're highly effective. They get the plane in the air, unlike the two planes out here. And at that point, another interesting thing happens. The first thing is that the individual is proud because they've got the plane in the air. They are purpose-led individuals. They're trying to achieve an effective outcome, and they do. The second interesting thing that happens is that the people within their group are proud, because people typically describe the number one source of pride they find is in seeing the achievement of others. The second source of pride is in helping those people succeed. And the third source of pride is their personal achievements. So I'm happy, my community's happy. The organization, incidentally, is also very happy because the plane's in the air and they spent $26 million on technology to get it there. But they fail to close the loop. Technology doesn't deliver the social outcome. People deliver social outcomes. If somebody's socially dysfunctional, you can give them as much technology as you like, and they'll be unable to achieve the outcome. So part of the context of the social age is that connectivity. There's probably a button. I had detailed instructions. There we are, how to get this back up. There are two systems at play. The formal system is kind of everything that you can see and own and control. So most of you, I suspect, have a position within a formal system. You're within an organization. You may have an office. You may have a badge. You've probably got a contract of employment. All of that is owned by the organization. The formal system is something we have built in order to be effective. And formal organizations are incredibly effective. They collectivize diverse areas of expertise, and they achieve effect at scale. But of course, we as people don't live in the formal system. We exist in social systems, tribal systems, in fact. We exist in systems which are built through primary cultural alignments, bonds of trust, me to you, and then in larger social structures, meta-social structures, which are not known one-to-one, but are known through reputation, are known through the network, interconnected through a network. These systems vary in quite significant ways. For a start, you can change the formal system all you like. You can restructure, you can hire people, you can fire people, you can build an office, you can do anything you want in that system. The social system is much more complex. You only have one formal system, but you have multiple concurrent and sometimes conflicting social ones. We belong to many different communities. And in each of those communities, we exert different types of power. coming back again to that point of power. The dynamic tension between these two is probably the context of leadership today. When you ask people how they are able to be effective, they tell quite interesting stories. So in that US Special Forces group, I just surveyed how often are you effective because of your formal power, and how often are you effective because of the permission and consensus of others. You average it out, they say 97% of the time I'm effective through the permission and consensus of others. 3% of the time I'm effective by shouting at people and telling them what to do. If you repeat that in different organizations, you do get some variation, but I've never measured it under 80% as the permission and consensus of others. It's probably telling quite a complex story in some ways. What it's probably showing is that formal power contextualizes social power. So they probably couldn't be effective without that 3% of formal power. But they almost certainly couldn't be effective without the 97% of consensual power. So perhaps our challenge, both individually and in our organizations, is to understand this, to understand that dynamic tension between those two systems, and to understand how will we develop individually and organizationally to recognize and empower social leadership. And social leadership in simple terms is power given to you by your community. Your formal leadership is given to you by an organization. Your social leadership is given to you by your community. You progress your formal power through your career. So typically, we sort of move up the structure reasonably slowly, and sometimes with a few sideways moves. Our social leadership seems to be far more fluid, far more contextual, far more dynamic. We probably take multiple different roles as social leaders every day. There's a mechanism of the cultural transmission of information, which is storytelling. Stories are the units by which we share knowledge within groups. Stories of consensus, stories of opposition, stories of dissent. Again, as you move into an organization, as you settle into your role, you start to hear stories. Some of them are small and safe stories. You know, where do you hang your coat? Where do you get your lunch? Who do you call for help? And some of them are complex organizational stories. Some of them are tribal and local. So it's no surprise that within organizations, people cluster into units. It could be a department or a team. It could be the floor of a building. But they give us our primary cultural alignment. It's pretty clear that primary cultural alignment forms very fast, probably hours into minutes into days. And it's a dominant social force. There's almost certainly a deep-seated sort of cognitive aspect of this, the desire to belong, the fear of being excluded. So we form our primary social alignment, and we share those local stories, and we become a member of a tribe, a trust-bonded unit. There's a secondary type of cultural alignment, which is understanding the complexity of the organization. And obviously, you've given yourself one of the most complex organizations in the world to understand in the National Health Service. But, you know, most organizations are complex in real terms. Secondary cultural alignment is quite interesting. I strongly suspect that some people never achieve it. And for those that do, it's probably an understanding of sort of global geopolitical forces. It's the ability to be a political operator at scale. And as a consequence of this, we become nested in local spaces, in local tribes. And that nesting makes it extraordinarily hard to change an organization. Because you can change that formal structure all you like. But changing the formal structure doesn't change the social structure. In fact, you can measure this. I've been able to measure in organizations that have grown by acquisition, such as Norwich Union going into Aviva. And you see that even after 3-year cultural transformation programs designed to help people integrate in a new identity, I've measured that up to 12 years after the completion of that program, and more than 50% of people in a team still identify as Norwich Union people. And they're not talking about geography. They're talking about pride and power. They're talking about identity. They're talking about the defining features of social systems. There are some quite significant impacts of this in other ways. The formal system gives us formal spaces, and within formal spaces, it's quite easy to hear voices that agree with what you think. Formal spaces typically, give a permission to agree. But in order to change, in order to evolve our organizations, we probably need to hear voices which are denied, voices which are hidden, voices, in fact, of subversion. That's quite an interesting thing. I ran a session with 47 of the most senior military leaders in the UK towards the start of the year. And I asked them how they are able to be effective. And they told some interesting stories. One of the youngest guys in the group, and they were all guys, he said, I'm extraordinarily effective at what I do, which is fair enough. And humility, probably not the selection criteria at play. But he said, I'll tell you exactly how I'm effective. I go out and get done the thing that needs to be done. And my specific competence is in retrospectively fitting what I've done into the rule set. And I'm able to do that because I'm surrounded by a community that covers my back whilst I'm out there being effective. That's quite interesting. What was more interesting was the two old guys next to me. One turned to the other and whispered, wow, he's brave to admit that. And it did strike me as somewhat curious, worrying maybe, that some of our senior leaders in that context are effective because they're brave enough to break the rules, which is, of course, typically the thing we punish people for. Now, of course, you don't want everybody going out and breaking rules regardless. But I do quite strongly suspect that many of our most effective organizations are highly effective almost despite everything they do in order to be effective. They're probably effective because they're full of brilliant, kind people like you who make them effective. And they do so at a hyper-local level. They hold each other safe while they do it. They share that knowledge within their local communities and teams. And they will never share it more widely and more globally because they will invoke the consequence of an organization that may not want to hear those voices of dissent. The funny thing about compliance-led systems is they're never compliant, which is perverse. But they're often never compliant because they don't hear the subversive voices which could help them to be better. They're very good at finding people that break rules and executing them. They're very bad at finding people who break rules in order to make the system better. As a social leader, we probably have a responsibility to both systems. And that can be tricky because your responsibility to your social system is a sort of local, dominant, tribal force. It's almost certainly stronger than loyalty, if I use that term, into the formal system. And it can bring us into conflict. But people describe these things quite clearly. I've just been running a 2-year research project looking at trust, the nature of trust between two people, within communities and teams, and in organizations themselves. And it's quite complicated. In fact, it's annoyingly complicated. You would hope that it would be logical and simple, but it's not. It's confusing. The mechanism behind the research is one of gathering stories, how people describe what trust is, how trust grows, how trust breaks, how it flows through systems. And some people describe trust as a matter of belief. Some people describe it in quasi-religious terms, in fact. Some people describe it in transactional terms. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. We're more likely to trust each other. Some people describe how trust grows very slowly. Some people describe the person that saved them from a burning room and they forged a bond of trust that will last through their whole life. There are some common features of trust, though, and it's to do with trust and the betrayal of trust. So The easiest way to look at it is to use some language which is used around consumer psychology, actually. But it describes when people gain something, their score sort of goes up. So when we find trust, we sort of move from 0 to 10. When we lose trust, we don't just drop down to 0. The act of betrayal ramps you right down to -15. Betrayal itself is an active force. The losing of trust is not a passive thing. It's an active and powerful thing. We're worse off when we've lost trust than before we had it. And that's quite interesting because it seems that a lot of the capability of our organization exists in these local trust-based units. I would argue that certainly as leaders, as social leaders, we need to understand some of the dynamics of how trust works and how it flows, and create the conditions in which trust may emerge. There's one thing for sure, you almost certainly can't make somebody trust you. In fact, the act of trying to make somebody trust you will almost certainly have the opposite outcome. Something that we may learn in our teenage years through a series of failed relationships. You know, it is a matter of belief to some extent. It's a matter of invested hope, perhaps. Trust is complex and interesting. I won't go in detail into this, but I tend to sketch a map of the social age every year and look at what some of the dominant global trends are, just to keep an eye on what's shifting. And I just thought I'd share this to give you a sense of some of the work I'm doing at a wider level. Community and collectivism is clearly a fundamental shift empowered by technology. I said before, we belong to many different communities in many different ways, but these communities are becoming increasingly powerful because we're also seeing the diminishing importance of infrastructure. So many organizations and industries are built on the centralization of infrastructure. Things are complex and expensive, but today many of those things are available in other ways, which is why we've seen the fragmentation of the publishing industry, the fragmentation of the media industry, why we're seeing the fragmentation of organizations as physical structures, because much of that capability is now available to us in different ways. We're seeing the rise of transnational organizations, and really at a sort of highest level, what we're seeing is the breakdown of the notion of nation itself. And I don't sort of say that lightly on a Friday afternoon, but if you just bear with me as we think about this. Historically, we've seen organizations, we've seen social systems organized in nations. You know, we live in a nation. Within that nation, there are a number of other large-scale aggregated social structures. Organized religion is one, healthcare is one, government is one, organizations making stuff, educational institutions. This is how our societies are built. Increasingly, people don't live in that world. There's a breakdown because geography and transportation technology used to be what defined nation. But now, of course, to all intents and purposes, transport is almost synchronous anywhere in the world. You can pretty much go where you want to go, so we're no longer limited by transport. Communication technology no longer limits how we communicate. And indeed, we're beyond the advent of synchronous machine translation. And as that becomes more deeply embedded, we'll move beyond culture. Because at the moment, I don't have anybody in my community in Vietnam because I don't speak Vietnamese. But we're really at a point where I can synchronously communicate with people in Vietnam, which means I can build a community of people with different cultural perspectives than me, which means culture, as limited by geography and communication and language, ceases to be an issue. We've become more globally connected, not just physically, but culturally, which means the flow of ideas can spread differently. But we're also seeing the breakdown of infrastructure. The old contract between government and citizen was, we will protect you, and you will pay taxes, and we will provide infrastructure. I'm slightly summarizing the contract between government and individual, but it's something like that. I promised I'd bring up Trump today. The first 3 months of the Trump presidency, what did we see? We saw the rolling back of certain civil liberties. We saw the sanctuary cities and sanctuary states standing up. But interestingly, we saw the transnationals, we saw Google and Apple and Facebook and Twitter saying to their people, we will protect you. We will defend your civil liberties. That's the function of government. But apparently it's now the function of the transnationals. And at the moment, the only time these transnational organizations ground themselves back in the real world is when we have an argument about tax. But now we're seeing infrastructure provided, not for taxation, but for subscription. We shouldn't misunderstand the impact of Netflix. It's not just television. It's dominant cultural influence for subscription. It's Elon Musk who will ultimately solve the challenge of whether we build another airport in London, probably by putting a hyperloop in somewhere. We will see subscription models of culture quite widely impacting social structures. Healthcare, obviously, is vulnerable to complete disruption. The financial service system, healthcare systems, because the context of what we do is changing. I say that carefully, but I say it quite confidently as well. We're clearly moving away from a purely exception-based model of healthcare towards a model of, I don't know what we call it, performance support, continuous improvement, distributed devices, people engaged in their own health immediately. Imagine simple things, as you can point your phone at your lunch and it will break it down and code it by color as to what you should or shouldn't eat more of. That kind of continual performance support in the moment. It's just around the corner. It's remarkably hard for a computer to recognize a carrot. But we're pretty much there. And once we are there, it unlocks all sorts of other things. So the context of our leadership is probably something like this. Our structural power frames our capability, but our social authority is what powers and permits us to be effective. So in our approaches to developing leadership, we still need to do some fantastic work that we do to develop formal aspects of leadership. But we probably need to also pay great attention to the way we develop social authority and social leadership. That might leave us with some interesting challenges. In the landscape of trust research, I looked initially at 12 different aspects of trust. And some things came through quite clearly. For starters, people don't trust the technology that organizations give them. In fact, they trust formal technology about 30% less than they trust social technology. Technology which is owned by a community rather than technology owned by an organization. Here's the perverse thing, even if it's the same piece of technology. So if they have a phone given to them by the organization and they're using their work email address, they trust that work email less than they trust their personal email on the same phone. Trust isn't about the physical object, it's about the context of ownership. It's a complicated area. The single most statistically significant factor across all 12 aspects of trust that we've looked at so far has been gender, quite interestingly. I can't give you a definitive answer of why that is, because it's entirely unclear to me. What I can tell you is that men and women use often different language to describe trust, as they describe how trust forms, how trust flows, and how trust breaks. They use different language. I don't think it means that trust is different for men and women, but I strongly suspect what we're accidentally uncovering is a culturally normalized inequality in the language that is used to describe trust. I certainly think it's significant. So what stops us changing? I wrote this slide the hour after I walked out. I did a briefing in the Pentagon last year, and I walked out and wrote this article called The Fear. Because, as with many systems, the military is often full of really, really bright people who really understand the need to change and are completely terrified of where that change will take them. Many systems are afraid of change. I take quite a pragmatic view of change. I think that most people are good. I think most people want to do the right thing. I think most of us are the problem. We are the reason why systems don't change, because we're fundamentally invested within the systems we have now. There's nothing fundamental stopping us from changing any system except ourselves. You know, the organizations we exist within are fake. We've made them up. We made up every rule. We made up every acronym and every name. It's perfectly within our capability to deconstruct them and put them together again in a different way. And yet I don't work with any organization anywhere in the world that puts as much effort into deconstructing system, process, rule and procedure as it does into building it. We just add layer after layer of complexity into our systems, and we nest within those systems. The things which impact it are that we want the brilliance that comes from people within the system, but we're terrified of that when it challenges the status quo. We want to give a permission to subvert things at certain times, but we're terrified that people will claim a permission to subvert things when we don't want them to, particularly the things that we are invested in. We want people to be connected when we want them to be connected, but we sure as heck don't want them to be connected when we don't want them to be connected, in a world of connectivity. We want to use progression through the formal system and promotion as the dominant lever of power over individuals. Play the game and behave, and we'll give you the next carrot. In a world where the carrot is going to be given to you by your reputational economy, your reputation within the system is what will give you real power. I suspect it's no coincidence that some of the most active individuals I engage with on channels like Twitter work in healthcare, many of them in the NHS. And it's not just consultants, it's many individual doctors and nurses claiming a voice, claiming real power actually within a system. These are different types of power. These are not the only types of power at play, but these are probably the types of power we have to fully understand. Our individual power is very strong, charismatic power. It's what operates one-to-one between individuals, but it doesn't scale all that far. Hierarchical power is the system that we operate within, which gives us certain other types of power. But networked power is the reputational economy. This work comes out of nearly 6 years now of research I've been doing with the military about innovation, disruption, and failure. Understanding how is it, I mean, logically, if you look at something like ISIS, Islamic State, has something like 10,000 members if you view it as an organization. If you drew the org chart, it would have 10,000 people in it, which isn't very many. It's smaller than Facebook. It's about the same size as LinkedIn, slightly under now. You know, we should be able to stop that. How hard can it be? But it's not built on hierarchical power, it's built on networked power. And the different thing is that if you are talking hierarchical power to hierarchical power, you can dominate and decimate something. You can deny its existence. But if you attack networked power, reputational power with a formal system, you typically actively reinforce and expand it. Our very attempts to disrupt that type of power make it stronger. And that's a challenge. If we live in a world which is used to being able to control formal power with other formal power, life was quite easy when we were just waiting for the Russians to roll some tanks up to the border. You just needed one more tank, or all of your tanks to perform 1% better. But today, we can't even understand if we're under attack. Are our democratic systems under attack? Are we being subverted in Salisbury, or is it food poisoning? You know, we just don't understand the context. There's an existential threat to this. Understanding types of power is essential. And to understand that the strength that got us this far, the strength that has formed the organizations we exist in today, will become a weakness if we don't evolve our organizations in the context of the social age. Does anybody have any questions? Ticking along. Being very polite. You're just practicing that sleep routine. Okay, I'm just going to use this one last slide, to be honest, and then talk through, use this to talk about what leadership means, and that means you've got a couple of minutes to think of some questions. What is our role as leaders and as leaders of leaders or educators of leaders? Well, I don't think our role is that complex, to be totally honest. Our role is probably to understand development is no longer a matter of having a story and telling it to other people and assessing them on whether they can remember the story. We're probably beyond that. Our role is almost certainly to hold open a space, to create a space in which people can find their leadership. I'm pretty confident that just giving people a job title doesn't make them a leader. Giving them the space to explore and to find their own flavour of leadership makes them a leader. There's an interesting thing in the NHS research we did looking at communities. People described the communities they're part of that help them to be effective. We took the top 20% of those communities and asked them, why are those communities so effective? What specifically is it about that community that it does to help you to be effective? And the number one thing people described was the choreography of engagement. The way they are welcomed into a community is the single most important factor in whether it becomes one of their top most effective communities to help them perform. And the funny thing is, we can influence that. We can think about how do we introduce people to communities? How do we choreograph engagement? How do we thank people for their efforts? How are we kind and compassionate within complex systems? And don't get me wrong, I suspect that many or most of you are kind and compassionate on a daily basis. Most of us are kind and compassionate to the people that we like. How will we be kind and compassionate across systems with those people that we frankly detest? How will we affect change unless we are able to help our own organisations become more interconnected, to understand our differences and to engage across those differences respectfully? The technology will allow us to hold open spaces. This is the gift of technology. It allows us to create spaces. But we can't just create formal spaces. We'll have to be willing to allow people to engage in any space they want. If you try to own the technology, people simply go elsewhere. They're spaces for community. A fundamental tenet of social leadership is to understand community, to understand the different types of communities that we're part of, the role and purpose that they serve. Within those spaces, what do we want people to do? We want people to explore. The most powerful mechanism I've used across multiple organizations for leadership development, from new inductees up to executive leaders, is not to give them a story of what leadership is. It's to create a space and a journey that they can travel through where they get to define the type of leader that they will be. And at the end of that journey, you don't get identikit leaders that all look the same. You get leaders who think and act differently. And that's as it should be, because we need that diversified strength. We need a range of opinions. We need difference as much as we need similarity. We need different perspectives. We need spaces for people to rehearse. The notion that we can somehow parachute in and perform may be appealing, but is almost certainly wrong. We need that language to permeate through. Where are our rehearsal spaces? Where are our performance spaces? And how do we vary consequence within rehearsal spaces? Not just formal consequence, social consequence. The dominant limiter on trying out new behaviours that people describe is not their fear they'll get something wrong and be punished by the system. It's the fear that they'll look like an idiot in front of their peers and colleagues. It's the dominant limiter on our ability to change. If you ask people why they can't change, they say they don't have time. But interestingly, if you give them time, you typically discover it's a specific capability, the ability to rehearse safely and move that rehearsal into performance. Space to innovate. There's a problem with young people. They're quite entitled. I was speaking to the chief HR officer of one of the biggest of the London law firms, and she said at the end of her 30-year career, I didn't ask her the question, she just volunteered this to me. She said, the problem with millennials is they just have this sense of entitlement. I said to her, it's because they're entitled. That's the truth of the matter. The social contract between organisation and individual is gone. It's gone because organisations, on the whole, have spent the last 50 years deliberately deconstructing it. They have fractured the social contract to treat people like things. People are treated like resources. They're treated unfairly. And so what's happened is we found a new home. There is a new home. People belong to communities. Indeed, we're seeing these outsourced backbones of career emerging that will almost certainly become dominant forces that organizations won't be able to operate without engaging with. They're likely to be the new guilds held outside formal structures. which value people, which provide them with a home, an opportunity, and from that home they can contract into organizations. But these are new entities that will never make them redundant, that won't sanction them, they'll simply support them. We need to give people space to innovate, to change the system that they are in. Next year I'll publish a book called The Change Handbook, which is looks at how we can change, how we can build more socially dynamic organizations. And the punchline of it is, if you want to change, you have to give people a space to co-create what the future space looks like, and to give them a choice as to where they will be invested within it. You can't drive change through formal mechanisms alone. You have to let people own it, and to let them share their stories of success and their stories of failure in safe ways. This, I suspect, is the context of leadership in the social age. Whilst you're thinking of your questions, I'll give you a couple of offers. I've just published, funnily enough, today, about an hour ago, my new book was published, which is called The Trust Sketchbook. I couldn't bring copies for everybody. I bought about 30 copies of the Trust Guidebook. So there were two parts of it, the Trust Guidebook, the Trust Sketchbook. Susie, who's one of my crewmates down here, has got some copies. If you want one of these, do grab one. If we don't have enough copies, if you drop me a note, I'll happily send you a copy. My main work on social leadership is across two books, the Social Leadership Handbook and the Social Leadership 100 Days book. And again, it's a kind of in gratitude for the work that you do. And it's not very trendy in England to say this, but it's very popular in America to say it. Thank you for all the work that you do. It's really valuable. I'm sure you're aware of that, but I think it's worth mentioning sometimes. If anybody would like a copy of the Social Leadership book, please drop me a note, and if you'll read it, I'll happily send you a copy. If you just need a doorstop, I'll send you a stone. I'll put my contact details up here. Does anybody have any questions? You're really being super polite. This is not my experience. When I was with 250 student nurses the other day, they were not this polite.
The problem with hierarchical organizations, they only ask questions after they clap.
Okay.
So Julian, thank you very much. A very articulate and thought-provoking presentation, and I'm sure that there will be some questions. Perhaps I can just start the ball rolling. Why do you think it is that doctors who, right from medical school onwards, tell stories to each other in the meeting rooms, in the pub, in the ward coffee room, wherever? And stories are important in part of what we do in making diagnoses and planning treatment and watching patients' courses. Why is it then that doctors, when they qualify and for the first few years, or even when they become consultants, don't regard themselves as leaders? There's plenty of evidence that that is so. It appears to be quite a contradiction.
Yeah, when we get sort of thrown into a system, we get given a role. We do get given formal power, but we're also heavily disenfranchised by the context of that power. And I suspect, to some extent, the reason why people do not feel like leaders is, frankly, because they're too busy to be learning how to be a leader. We certainly see this in specific contexts. In engineering organizations, you get a similar progression where people tend to get thrust into a position entirely unable to lead. In that sense, creating spaces for people to find that power is important. The other interesting piece about, I'll try and say this carefully, the interesting thing about the NHS in particular is that you already have two contexts of power. There's the formal role of your job within a hospital or a system, and there's a secondary role in terms of the colleges and the professional, the domain type of homes. So you're already caught in this quite complex dynamic. And clearly, the hospitals represent structural power, but the colleges represent dynastic power. And I suspect somewhere in that tension and that confusion, the context of individual leadership is quite heavily inhibited. Would that be I'm not sure if that analysis is correct.
Right, there's questions from the audience. Please say who you are and ask your question when you hold the microphone.
Hi, Jeff Shaw from Liverpool Women's Hospital. You on your diagram that you showed of different types of power, you had hierarchical power, and I think you call it networked power on the right. How do you explain sort of movements before the digital age, say such as the suffragette movement or the Chartist movement historically, which were lots of people in different places doing their own thing but coming together for the common good? How does that fit in into your system in a way?
It's exactly the same way. That's exactly what they were doing. It's precisely the same. There's nothing new about the types of power. What's new is the context in which they happen. So if we look back at the mechanisms of movements like the suffragettes, they were pamphleting, printing pamphlets on printing presses which were controlled by people who may or may not want to support their story. Today, I need neither the printing press, nor do I need a door to nail my pamphlet to. So the specific things that we see is that the context of the social age facilitates and enables the mechanisms of protest and subversion, while simultaneously diminishing the power of the formal system to constrain the story. So there's nothing new. It's the same thing at much greater scale. It's a dominant effect rather than an exceptional one. There are also secondary parts of that. The synchronicity of response is interesting, and our ability to engage directly. I've been writing recently about the erosion of sanctity. I ran a session, a really fascinating session with 12 people in Congress in the United States and the Pentagon, so 12 very senior leaders. And the theme that we were talking about was the loss of sanctity, the sanctity of space, the sanctity of power. So we've lost spaces which many organizations were built around, the private office, the senior people being further up, church spaces, government spaces, courthouses. They were all separate. Power was held separately. And today it's much more broken down. So that synchronicity, the loss of sanctity, and the sheer enablement of that power you describe is amazing. It lets an individual hold a government to account. The young lady whose name I'm afraid I can't remember, the survivor of the Parkfield shooting, the young girl with her shaved head standing up to her senator saying, why are you dismissing me? Why are you not hearing my story? She had an authentic story. I've written quite widely about that. I'll happily share the case study analysis with you. She shared an authentic story. I just surveyed 2,500 people in Apple who've adopted the social leadership work globally. They identified 69 different traits they look for in leadership. Number one, by a long margin, when they ranked them, was authentic storytelling. So what you described, those movements are about authentic storytelling, driving change, and they can do it even better today.
Thank you. The questions are stacking up. There's one
I'll
right over there.
Faster, I promise.
Sorry, my name's Rob Johnson. I'm a consultant at Alderhay. I'm slightly worried. I'm not quite sure it's true, or I'm going to challenge that. So Emily Pankhurst would probably have some idea of how to build a printing press. But how many people in this room would know how to build an internet server or program it? I think in some ways, though we have this huge connectivity, we are much more dependent at a remove on people who do things that we don't understand in any way. So if they turn the tap off, we will lose all that, whereas at least Emily Pankhurst could probably have gone and got a hacksaw out and made cogwheels and made her own printing. I trivialize, but so I'm not actually sure that though we have this sort of apparent democratization in terms of our ability to connect, I'm not sure that we're not being undermined in a very subtle way about that centralization of connection being able to be controlled in a way that is we're giving up.
So, I mean, I'll sort of respond in a couple of ways to that. I'll probably disagree with you, respectfully. So the first thing is, I think if Emily Pankhurst wanted to build a printing press, she'd have had to go and find a book on how to do it, or somebody knew how to do it. And today I can Google it. So my access to knowledge is much faster.
Exactly what I'm saying is, if I take away your access to Google, what is your skill set? Could you put together a computer and connect it to the internet and make your protest on the internet without the use of the big infrastructure that is actually controlled by people who you do not know? And
well,
got the point.
I mean, the sort of the simple answer to that question is no. However, I dispute the validity of the question. If you look at the development of technology, technology has always been about layered complexity. So in the earliest stages, we exist as an individual of one. You know, I had to go out and find a mammoth and bring it to the ground. But I discovered it was easier to do it with my mates. So we came together and did that. And then we learnt how to make tools, and we learnt how to put those together. So I absolutely cannot build a computer. Organizations have come about precisely for that purpose, to collectivize and achieve effect at scale. The question of, you know, could this happen without that free access to technology? Absolutely, it could not happen. But my point is, we have the access to that technology. And interestingly, to your example of Google, this is precisely the question of how the transnationals will ground themselves back in geopolitical power. Because right now, if we had to make a bet, what's going to save us? Is it going to be the UN? Is it going to be NATO? Is it going to be America? The thing that's probably going to save us is that people everywhere like to be reasonably comfortable and want some Nikes. And at the point when Google says, actually, we're not going to provide service in Moscow, is the point when you'll see civil unrest destroy the system. So, I don't dispute that part of it. What I think I would say, kind of as I said at the start, my work is about sketching, looking into the darkness and sort of thinking, I wonder what's going on out there. Much of it is wrong. I'll often say 99% of it is wrong. The thing I'm absolutely sure about is that the old model has gone as well. So I think it's our responsibility to raise these questions, to explore these issues, but in quite a pragmatic way. So it's a good question, and I think it's okay that we might disagree if we could have used that to explore what the new, better story might be.
And right to the other end of the room, yes, please say who you are.
Kate Lenton, paediatric A&E consultant. In a world where we have GMC versus Bauer-Garber, Trump versus free speech, universities versus who's allowed to speak and free speech, how do we solve the dichotomy between what seems to be increasing groupthink and thought police being sent out and the open space thinking that we need for the social development to move on to that next step?
So thanks for the question. It's a very complicated question, and so I'll just try to stick to the bits that will be unpopular. I think that most of this narrative, for example, of Trump versus free speech or the free speech or echo chambers and groupthink, I think most of that narrative is wrong. I think much of it is a narrative imposed on people whose views we don't agree with. So the reason I say that is this. For sure, and I've written quite widely about it, and I'm not commenting in a political sense, but for sure we can say, well, Trump opposes free speech. However, I suspect that if you are a Trump supporter or Trump himself, you don't think that you're opposing free speech. We probably here don't think we're opposing free speech, but what I was quite surprised about is there's a group of 4 musicians in London right now who are operating under a court order that prevents them from using certain words in their music, prevents them from making music and performing music in certain quarters, because the type of music they make is drill music, and this is associated with gang violence. So we've decided to limit their ability to say things we don't want them to say. There's plenty of fantastic literature in fact, there's a whole section in W.H. Smith's I saw yesterday of banned books. So we shouldn't delude ourselves that we exist in an environment of completely free speech. I generally take a pragmatic view that for sure it's easy to see how some domains limit speech in certain ways, but all domains limit speech in certain ways. groupthink is interesting because, of course, we are all victims of the same thing. So there clearly are features around sort of echo chambers, but that's also another way of saying, how on earth do we survive in the world? We generally survive by coming up with ideas and bouncing them off people, and we survive through that mechanism of consensus forming and agreement. So it's a little bit tricky. I don't want to get sort of too deep into it, but what I would say, I think, is this. Firstly, you're looking at exactly the right areas. I think as a society, we have a great responsibility to look at these areas. Secondly, I think we have a great responsibility to question the people providing a narrative. So much of the media, and indeed many of our political systems, carry a naive narrative, which is often about the continuation of their own established forms of power. I've been doing some very interesting work with, in fact, really hard work with the federal government in Canada about the impacts of technology on democracy. I was up late. I didn't get to bed till nearly 1 o'clock last night because I was WhatsApping with a group who I'm trying to get a permission to do some research with. It's a First Nation group who are on a reservation in Canada, which we always think of as very liberal, easygoing democracy. There's a group of 3,000 there. And the group I was messaging with last night are nurses and healthcare professionals on the nursing station there. There were 16 nurses and 2 doctors that fly in as needed. And one of the nurses was telling me about why she had had a bad day. I'd had a bad day because my train from London was disrupted. She had had a bad day because she had just flown back in for the start of her 6-week stint. And forgive me if I get any of my medical jargon wrong, she'd dropped her duffel bag as she got off the plane. So, see, I knew I wouldn't be able to tell this story. It's a hard story. She'd dropped her bag so that she could go and take over from the police officer that was trying to do chest compressions on a 12-year-old girl who'd siphoned petrol out of the police cruiser to sniff the petrol and has now, literally yesterday, joined the 16 children under the age of 16 years old that she's had to deal with since the start of this year, committing suicide because their voice isn't heard. So it's easy to talk about fake news, and it's easy to talk about easy narratives. But, the reality is that technology is neither good or bad. What's quite often bad is our structures of society that fail to listen to people and steal their voice away, take away their right and permission to be part of society. I made a promise last night that I would write again about citizenship, about that community in liberal Canada that's had no access to electricity for 12 years. So I'm able to connect with a group of 16 nurses helping their community on WhatsApp on the other side of the world to try to tell their story. And I'm trying to get permission to interview people within that community to share their story and to use some of the research techniques to characterize trust within those communities. So it's rambling on an answer to the question, but it's this. I think that most of our structures of society are outdated in some ways. Whether we agree or not on the impacts of technology, whether we agree or not on the validity of systems or political ideologies doesn't matter. The thing is that the context of our leadership, the context of society has changed. It's easier to find a voice, it's easier to share a voice. Part of our responsibility is to fight for fairness, to ensure that citizenship means something. It's as much about responsibility as it is about rights. So I suppose, my point is, we can't allow ourselves to be deluded by naive narratives. I was excited to come and work with you today because I know that doctors aren't idiots. We've all had a lot of education. We've all seen a lot of stuff. We've all done good work, and we've probably all done things that we're not proud of or that we're, stories of failure in our own practice. It's our responsibility to change these systems. I'm pretty certain that no politician is going to make healthcare better in the UK. I'm pretty sure no accountant is going to make it better in the UK. I'm pretty sure it's going to be us. We're going to have to engage across our differences in order to do that.
Julian, I think on that note and the story, thank you very much for an inspiring speech.